Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. After my husband's funeral, while I was still dressed in black and barely standing, his father looked me in the eye and said the house was never mine. My name is Emily Carter. Just hours earlier, I had buried my husband, Daniel Carter. I remember the sound of dirt hitting the coffin more clearly than the prayers. My hands were shaking, my head felt heavy, and every breath hurt. Daniel was my home, my safety, my best friend. Losing him felt like the world had gone quiet and cruel all at once. At the graveside, people stood in small groups, whispering and avoiding my eyes. I didn't blame them. I barely knew how to stand, let alone talk. Daniel's father, Richard Carter, stayed close, watching me in a way that made my skin crawl. He didn't look sad. He looked patient, like he was waiting for the right moment. That moment came when most people had started to leave. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't mention his son. He simply said that the house Daniel and I lived in was a family property and always had been. He said it calmly, like he was explaining a rule I should have known. For a second, I didn't understand what he meant. My mind was still at the cemetery, still with Daniel. Then his words sank in. He wasn't talking about paperwork or future discussions. He was telling me that the home I shared with my husband, the place where we planned our life, was not mine anymore. I felt my knees weaken. That house was where Daniel and I laughed, argued, dreamed, and healed. I helped paint the walls. I planted flowers in the backyard with him. Every corner held a memory. Hearing Richard claim it felt like losing Daniel all over again. I looked around, hoping someone would step in, but no one did. His wife stood a few feet away, pretending not to listen. The rest of the family avoided my eyes. I realized then that this wasn't sudden. This was planned. They had been waiting until Daniel was gone and I was too broken to fight back. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him he was cruel and heartless. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there in my black dress, feeling small and powerless. Richard took my silence as weakness. He nodded once, as if the matter was settled, and walked away. As I watched him leave, something inside me shifted. I was still grieving. I was still broken. But beneath the pain, a quiet strength began to form. They thought this was the end for me. They thought I would walk away without a fight. They were very wrong. Daniel and I didn't start with much. When we got married, we had more hope than money. We rented a small place at first, shared old furniture, and laughed about how one day things would be better. Daniel worked long hours, and I worked wherever I could. We supported each other in quiet ways, like late-night talks at the kitchen table and handwritten notes left before work. Our life wasn't fancy, but it was honest and full of love. From the beginning, his parents were polite to me, but never warm. Richard Carter was distant, always watching, always judging. His wife, Margaret Carter, smiled often, but her smile never reached her eyes. They treated me like someone temporary, like I was just passing through their family instead of becoming part of it. I told myself I was being sensitive and tried harder to fit in. Whenever we visited them, there were small comments that made me uncomfortable. Richard liked to talk about the Carter family legacy and how certain things were meant to stay within the family. Margaret would nod along and mention how traditions mattered more than feelings. They never said my name during those talks, but I knew who they meant. When Daniel and I finally moved into our home, I was proud. It felt like proof that we had built something real together. I decorated it with care, choosing colors Daniel liked and turning it into a place of peace. But even then, his parents didn't celebrate with us the way I expected. Richard inspected the house instead of complimenting it. Margaret asked questions about paperwork and ownership that felt strange at the time. Daniel always brushed it off. He said his father worried too much about control and his mother followed along to keep the peace. He promised me that what we built together was ours. I trusted him completely. There was no reason not to. Still, there were moments that stayed in my mind. Richard would remind Daniel that family property comes with responsibility. Margaret once joked that paperwork mattered more than promises. I laughed along, thinking they were just old-fashioned. I didn't want to create problems where there were none. As time passed, Daniel became more careful about certain topics. Whenever money or documents came up, he changed the subject or said we would talk later. I noticed he kept some papers locked away and handled things quietly. When I asked him once if everything was okay, he told me he was just being organized and that I didn't need to worry. I believed him, but deep down, I felt something was being left unsaid. Not in a dishonest way, but in a protective one. Daniel loved deeply, but he also carried the weight of knowing his parents better than I did. Looking back, the signs were there. The polite distance. The careful words. The way Daniel tried to shield me without explaining why. At the time, I thought our love was enough to handle anything. I didn't realize how much planning Daniel was doing behind the scenes, or that his silence was part of a much bigger picture. A few days after the funeral, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. The house was quiet in a way that felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. When I opened the door, Richard stood there in a dark coat, calm and stiff. Next to him was a man in a suit holding a briefcase. Richard didn't ask to come in. He simply stepped forward, as if the house already belonged to him. They sat at the dining table where Daniel and I used to eat together. The man in the suit placed a folder on the table and opened it neatly. Richard spoke in a flat voice, explaining that the property was considered family property and that it would return to the blood family. He said it like it was a rule, not a choice. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the papers. I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. Nothing made sense. This was my home. I had lived here, cared for it, and built my life in it. The attorney explained things in careful words, but all I heard was that I was expected to leave. There was no apology in his voice, no sympathy. Just instructions. Margaret stood near the doorway, her hands folded. She didn't say a word. She didn't defend me or question what was happening. She watched as if this had been decided long ago. Every now and then, she looked at the walls, the furniture, the floors, as if measuring what would stay and what would go. Richard said it would be best if I packed my personal items quickly to avoid complications. He used that word like it meant inconvenience, not heartbreak. He said the family didn't want conflict and expected cooperation. Hearing that made my chest ache. They were pushing me out and calling it peace. I felt small sitting there, like I didn't belong in my own home anymore. My hands rested on the table, and I noticed how empty the room felt without Daniel. I wished he were there to speak for me, to stand between me and this moment. But I was alone. I asked if I had time. Richard nodded once and said a few days would be reasonable. He stood up, signaling the meeting was over. The attorney closed the folder and avoided my eyes. Margaret followed them out without looking back at me. When the door closed, the silence felt louder than before. I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the couch, the doorway to our bedroom. It felt like being erased piece by piece. Not just from the house, but from the family I thought I had married into. I felt humiliated. I felt betrayed. Most of all, I felt invisible. They saw me as an obstacle, not a person. As I stood there, surrounded by memories, I realized they believed I had no choice. They believed grief had made me weak. They had no idea what was coming next. That night, I stayed in the house alone. The lights were low, and the rooms felt larger than usual. Every sound echoed. I walked slowly from room to room, not packing yet, just remembering. I ran my fingers over the kitchen counter where Daniel used to stand in the mornings, half awake, smiling at me while his coffee brewed. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the empty space beside me. Grief came in waves. Sometimes it was quiet, like a dull ache. Other times it hit so hard I had to sit down and breathe through it. I talked to Daniel out loud, asking him how everything fell apart so fast. I told him I was tired and scared. Saying his name made the house feel less empty. As I stood in the living room, my eyes landed on a small mark on the wall. Daniel and I had argued there once about hanging a picture straight. The memory made me smile for a second, then my chest tightened again. Everything in that house carried him in some way. Then I remembered a night from years earlier. We were sitting together, and Daniel suddenly grew serious. He told me there were things about his family I might not fully understand yet. He said that if something ever happened to him, I should trust what he had put in place. I had laughed it off at the time, telling him he was being dramatic. He didn't laugh back. He just said it would be important someday. Standing there now, those words came back clearly. Not as a warning, but as a promise. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who left things unfinished. He planned carefully, especially when it came to protecting the people he loved. I realized then that his silence in the past hadn't been avoidance. It had been preparation. I thought about how calm he always was when his parents spoke about control and rules. He never argued loudly. He listened. He remembered. I began to see the pattern I had missed before. Daniel had known exactly how this would play out. He had known they would come for the house. He had known they would try to push me aside. For the first time since the funeral, my fear softened. It didn't disappear, but it changed shape. In its place, something steadier formed. I wasn't just a grieving widow sitting in someone else's plan. I was part of Daniel's plan too. I wiped my tears and took a deep breath. Whatever Daniel had done, he had done it with care. I didn't know the details yet, but I trusted him. I trusted that he hadn't left me unprotected. That night, I didn't sleep much. But I wasn't drowning anymore. My sadness turned into focus. I stopped asking why this was happening and started thinking about what to do next. They believed I was alone and defeated. They believed time and pressure would break me. As I stood in that quiet house, I made a silent promise to myself and to Daniel. I would see this through. The next morning, I searched through Daniel's old contacts until I found the name he once mentioned during a serious conversation, Laura Benson. He had described her as someone who didn't waste time or words. I called her office with shaking hands and explained who I was. When I said Daniel's name, her tone changed. She told me to come in that afternoon. Laura's office was quiet and plain. She greeted me with a firm handshake and invited me to sit. She didn't offer sympathy right away. Instead, she asked clear questions and listened carefully. After a moment, she opened a file and said Daniel had prepared for this situation more than once. Hearing that made my heart race. She explained that years earlier, Daniel had filed a sealed document that only took effect after his death. He had been very specific about when it could be opened and who it would protect. Laura told me he insisted on keeping certain things separate, even though it made some family members unhappy. At the time, she hadn't known exactly why, but she had respected his wishes. When she opened the document, I felt like the room grew smaller. Daniel had written everything clearly. He knew there might be conflict. He knew people might try to take what wasn't theirs. The document wasn't about emotion. It was about control and foresight. Laura explained that the house itself wasn't the most important part of what Daniel owned. Richard had focused on it because it was visible and easy to claim. But Daniel had structured things in a way that tied the property to responsibilities that came with it. Without understanding the full picture, anyone trying to take it would step into a complicated situation. As Laura spoke, I finally understood why Daniel handled money the way he did. Why he kept some accounts separate and avoided certain discussions. He wasn't hiding anything from me. He was protecting both of us. He had built a wall between his family's expectations and our future. Laura looked at me and said that Daniel trusted me to follow through calmly, not emotionally. He had left clear instructions and warned that acting too soon could undo everything. Hearing that made me straighten in my chair. This wasn't about reacting. It was about timing. For the first time I felt grounded. The fear that had followed me for days began to lift. I wasn't standing on nothing. Daniel had left me solid ground, even if I couldn't see it at first. Before I left, Laura told me to let things play out a little longer. She said patience would be my strongest tool. I nodded, even though every part of me wanted to confront Richard immediately. As I walked out of the office, the air felt different. I finally understood that the house wasn't the prize they thought it was. Daniel had seen further than all of us. And now, so did I. I told Richard and Margaret that I would cooperate. I would pack my things and leave the house without argument. I spoke quietly, with my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking inside. I wanted them to believe I was defeated, that grief had broken me completely. Richard's eyes brightened, and I could see the smug satisfaction in his expression. Finally, he thought, this is over. He immediately started talking about renovations, listing changes he wanted to make, imagining the house under his control. He spoke as if I had never lived here, as if all our memories didn't matter. Margaret stood nearby, her face carefully soft. She whispered, "It's best for you to move on, Emily. You need a fresh start." Her words were like silk hiding a knife, polite but empty. I nodded politely at both of them, agreeing to their terms. Every word I spoke was measured. I smiled at their assumptions and even helped by organizing a few things temporarily, making it look like I was preparing to leave. I wanted them to feel confident, to believe they had won. But behind the calm and politeness, I was following Daniel's plan exactly. I had the sealed documents, the instructions he left through Laura, and the strategy he had carefully prepared. Everything Daniel had set up required patience. Nothing could be rushed. I made sure every step I took looked ordinary, predictable, and weak. I wanted Richard to relax, to let his guard down completely. I spent that day quietly observing. Richard measured walls and planned paint colors, completely unaware of the responsibilities hidden in the property's legal structure. Margaret continued with her fake kindness, checking in as if she were worried about me. I listened, nodded, and kept my thoughts to myself. Every smile and polite word was a mask. It was strange to feel this kind of quiet power. Outwardly, I seemed small and defeated. Inside, I was focused and alert. I thought about Daniel, about how he had anticipated this moment, and I realized the advantage we had. They had misread the situation entirely. They saw only what was visible, the house, the furniture, the space they assumed they could control. They didn't see the groundwork Daniel had laid for me to protect myself. By the end of the day, I had packed a few things just enough to maintain the illusion, but I hadn't given up anything of real value. Richard left the house talking about contractors and schedules, completely unaware that he had already walked into a situation he couldn't control. Margaret offered more advice on moving forward, and I thanked her politely, hiding the satisfaction building inside me. That night, I sat in the living room, thinking about the next steps. I reminded myself to stay patient and follow the plan exactly. They thought they had won. They thought they had taken control. But all they had done was step right into the situation Daniel had prepared for me. And soon, everything would change. A few days later, a formal meeting was arranged to finalize the property transfer. I sat across the table from Richard, who looked calm and certain, as if nothing could go wrong. His smugness filled the room. Margaret lingered quietly behind him, pretending to watch over the process, but clearly pleased with how confident Richard appeared. The attorney handed over the stack of documents and explained each page briefly. Richard barely looked at them. He skimmed quickly, nodded, and started signing. He didn't read carefully, trusting that the words were routine. He didn't notice the fine details hidden inside the legal language. I watched quietly, keeping my expression neutral, letting him feel in control. Once the last signature was on the paper, Laura Benson finally spoke. She had been silent up to that point, letting Richard's overconfidence grow. Then she explained the full structure Daniel had set up years before. Every legal measure, every contingency, Every detail had been thought out to protect me and ensure that anyone trying to claim the house without following the rules would face serious consequences. Richard's confident smile faltered as Laura went through the document line by line. She explained how Daniel had placed conditions and responsibilities on the property. It wasn't simply about ownership. Any misstep could leave the inheritor liable for debts, taxes, and obligations they hadn't anticipated. What he thought was a simple victory was anything but. Margaret gasped softly, covering her mouth. Richard leaned forward, scanning the papers, his eyes widening as he realized he hadn't understood a single part of what he was signing. Laura calmly reminded him that Daniel had anticipated greed and overconfidence. Everything had been arranged to protect Emily. The room felt heavy with silence. For the first time, Richard and Margaret were not in control. The house, which had seemed like the prize, was now the least of Richard's problems. Daniel had created a legal structure that forced accountability, shifted burdens, and secured assets in a way that left them scrambling. I sat back and let it sink in. I didn't have to argue, threaten, or push. Daniel had done it all. Their own assumptions, their arrogance, had led them right into the trap. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of calm power. The grief and fear from days before had been replaced with clarity and focus. Richard tried to speak, but the words stumbled out awkwardly. Margaret remained silent, too shocked to even protest. Laura finished explaining everything, and then closed the file with a soft click, leaving them to process the consequences. I realized then that this was more than just winning back the house. It was about Daniel's foresight, his trust in me, and my patience in following his plan. Everything had gone exactly as he intended. They had believed they could bully and intimidate me, but in the end, the law, carefully structured, was on my side. I walked out of that room quietly, not triumphant in noise, but triumphant in knowing that justice, carefully planned and patiently executed, had finally arrived. After the meeting, the full truth about Daniel's planning became clear. The house wasn't just a home, it had been placed in a trust tied to long-term liabilities. I didn't fully understand it at first, but Laura explained patiently. Any attempt to claim it without following Daniel's instructions would mean inheriting debts, taxes, and legal responsibilities, more than anyone could handle without careful planning. The property was protected, but not in the way Richard had imagined. Richard's face went pale as he realized what he had signed. His confidence disappeared in seconds, replaced by shock. He had thought the house would give him control and comfort, but now it came with burdens he hadn't expected. Taxes were high, bills overdue, and obligations tied to the property meant he could easily lose money instead of gaining it. He leaned back in his chair, trying to grasp the situation, but it was too late. Every smug calculation he had made had been wrong. Margaret's expression changed too. Her eyes widened, and she looked around the room as if searching for someone to blame. The arrogance that had guided their behavior for years vanished in an instant. They had assumed that I was powerless, that grief would make me yield, but Daniel had outsmarted them completely. Meanwhile, I learned that Daniel had secured everything else for me in a protected way. My accounts, our savings, and other assets had been structured so that I had financial freedom. I wasn't just safe, I had security that Richard and Margaret could never touch. For the first time in days, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. Daniel had left me more than memories. He had left me stability and independence. As Laura walked them through the documents, Richard's panic grew. He realized he would have to take on responsibilities he hadn't counted on. Bills, taxes, maintenance, all the things he thought I would be handling, now fell on him. He stumbled over questions, tried to argue, and yet every answer led back to Daniel's careful planning. Every step had been anticipated. Margaret tried to intervene, but even her polite tone couldn't hide the panic in her voice. They had expected to win easily, to take the house and perhaps humiliate me further, but now they were trapped by their own greed and Daniel's foresight. I watched quietly, my heart steady. I didn't feel joy over their panic, I felt relief and a deep sense of justice. The property that had seemed so important to them was no longer a prize, it was a burden. The real inheritance was clear. Daniel had left me with everything I needed to move forward without fear. In that room, the balance of power shifted completely. What had been arrogance became panic. What had been control became confusion. And I realized that Daniel's love for me didn't end with his death, it had been his plan all along to protect me from their greed. For the first time, I could breathe, knowing that I was free, secure, and ready to take the next step. Richard slammed his hand on the table, making the papers jump. His face was red, his voice sharp. "You tricked me," he shouted. "This is manipulation. You used your husband's death to steal what's ours." He leaned forward, pointing at me, anger and disbelief written all over his features. I stayed calm, sitting back in my chair, letting him vent. I spoke slowly, choosing each word. "I didn't trick anyone, Richard. Daniel planned this. He knew you and Margaret would try to take control. He wanted to protect me, and he did. Everything you see here is his foresight, not my doing." I looked at him steadily. "This isn't about me being clever. It's about Daniel making sure that greed wouldn't harm the people he loved." Richard's face turned pale as he realized he had underestimated both Daniel and me. His voice wavered, then grew louder. "You're lying. He wouldn't do this to his family." I shook my head gently. "He did it because he knew how dangerous it could be if you acted out of selfishness. Daniel loved me, but he also knew how far you might go. That's why he protected me." Margaret started to cry quietly, her hands covering her face. I could see the weight of realization hitting her. Her voice trembled as she admitted, we were wrong. We let greed blind us. We thought taking the house was the right thing, but it cost us everything." She sank into her chair, overwhelmed. I stayed silent for a moment, letting her feel the full truth. Then I spoke clearly, finally letting my own voice carry the years of pain, fear, and betrayal. For too long, I stayed silent. I smiled, nodded, and pretended it didn't hurt. I didn't fight back because I didn't want more conflict. I didn't want to dishonor Daniel's memory. But today, I will speak. I am not weak. I am not powerless. I am his wife, and I am protected because of him." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at me, finally understanding that his anger had no power here. I wasn't reacting out of emotion or revenge, I was standing in the space Daniel had prepared for me, steady and unshaken. Margaret wiped her tears, unable to say anything more. The arrogance and control that had defined their behavior for years had collapsed under the weight of truth. They had assumed I was vulnerable, that I could be pushed aside, but all of it had been a miscalculation. I took a deep breath, letting the silence in the room fill the space. This was the moment I had been waiting for, not to humiliate them, not to gloat, but to assert the truth. Daniel's foresight, his planning, and his love had protected me, and now I could finally speak, finally claim the space I had earned. Richard's anger faded into stunned quiet. Margaret's tears spoke of regret and loss. And I sat there, calm and firm, finally free to honor Daniel's memory and stand up for myself. When the meeting ended, I stood up slowly, folding my hands in front of me. Richard and Margaret remained at the table, silent and shaken. I didn't rush. I didn't gloat. I simply walked out, calm and steady. I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, I felt truly free. The weight of fear, uncertainty, and grief had lifted. I knew I was safe, financially secure, and protected. Outside the building, the air felt lighter than I remembered. The sky was clear, the sun soft on my face. I took a deep breath and let it fill me with strength. I realized that everything Daniel had done was so that I could walk away with dignity, without anger, without chaos. His foresight had given me more than money or a house, it had given me control over my own life again. I began searching for a new place, somewhere I could truly start fresh. I wanted a home filled with light, hope, and quiet happiness, somewhere not tied to the pain, betrayal, and manipulation I had just survived. I imagined a place where I could laugh again, where memories would be mine alone, free from others' interference. Each step in that search felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried under grief. As I looked at the options, I thought about Daniel. I thought about the way he had anticipated everything, the care he had taken to ensure I would be protected even after he was gone. It amazed me how much he had thought of me, how deeply he had loved me, and how clever and deliberate he had been. Even in death, he had guarded me against harm, against greed, and against despair. I remembered the little things he had done over the years, the quiet conversations, the careful arrangements, the promises he kept. It wasn't just the legal protections, it was the trust he placed in me to follow through, the faith he had in our love and in my strength. That thought filled me with gratitude, and I realized that love isn't just about the present, it's about planning for the future. Walking through the doors of my new home for the first time, I felt a sense of liberation. I placed my hand on the wall, imagining all the moments I would create here, moments that belonged only to me. I felt free from the shadows of betrayal and the weight of others' greed. I had survived, not just grief, but the cunning and arrogance of those who underestimated me. I smiled quietly to myself, thinking how Daniel had outsmarted them all. He had proven that love plans ahead, that true care protects even in unseen ways, and that greed never truly wins. I knew that as long as I carried his wisdom and foresight with me, I could face anything. That day, I walked into a new chapter of my life with dignity, strength, and peace, knowing I had been loved and protected beyond measure. And I promised myself I would live fully, with courage and clarity, because Daniel had shown me what true love could do.